They began the process of forming this battalion of Colonial Marines. A local Maroon named Garcon came into the fort at Pensacola, Fort San Miguel, which the British had previously called Fort George. They realized he had enormous potential as a non-commissioned officer. They made him the sergeant major. Others came in, Prince and Cyrus. Many others began to come into the fort there. Some others began to arrive at Prospect Bluff. From all of these men, they began to form this force of Colonial Marines, a battalion of them under Nicholls's command, with Woodbine as the second in command. Working with these non-commissioned officers and with officers that the British had brought with them, they started to form this battalion of Colonial Marines. It was a very effective fighting force. It was trained by British Royal Marines. Now, I think it's important that we understand that there really was no difference between this battalion of Colonial Marines that Woodbine and Nichols were forming at Prospect Bluff and Pensacola, and with the companies of Royal Marines that they brought with them, who were already members of the British military. The only difference is that this particular battalion of Colonial Marines was being formed in Florida. They called them Colonial Marines because they were from the colonies, as the British called them, or as the British termed, Spanish Florida and the United States and the Bahamas. They call us the colonies today in Great Britain, and so that's what they called Colonial Marines. They were Royal Marines in every other sense of the word. They wore the uniforms of the Royal Marines. They received training from officers of the Royal Marines. They were Royal Marines. They were called Colonial Marines because that's what the entire big force of Colonial Marines, these battalions that were being formed, along the coasts of North America. They were armed just like other Marines. They were trained just like other British Marines. Nichols trained them. Nichols was, one of the top, most courageous Marines. He had been in over 100 combat actions by this point. He had been wounded many times. They called him Fighting Nichols for a reason. And they had sent him on this assignment for a reason. He also was a huge proponent of abolition. He had been a proponent of abolition for many years. And so anyone who came into one of these British posts, they became free the instant they set foot in one of these forts under British law. These British Marine posts were treated just the same as a British ship at sea, and a British ship at sea was exactly the same as the soil of Great Britain. So if you were someone who was in slavery, you could self-liberate yourself by walking through the gates of one of these forts. And once you stepped through the gates of one of these forts, you self-liberated, and then you were a free person who could join the British military, and only free people could serve in the armed forces of Great Britain. So Nichols worked with them. He worked with Garcon. He worked with Cyrus and Prince. And so they held rank. They held positions over other Colonial Marines. I think it's important that we note also that not all of these Colonial Marines were people of color. There were white men who joined this force of Colonial Marines. Some of them were deserters from the American Armed Forces. They were living in Pensacola, and they joined these British Colonial Marines. This is a unique thing that Nichols and Woodbine did in Pensacola, because by putting Cyrus and Prince, and especially Garcon as the sergeant major, in command of these companies, they were putting black men, men of color, over white men. And that was something that was extremely unique on the Gulf Coast. That was something that you may have seen in Spanish regiments, but that was something that Americans who may have been there spying had never seen before. And that was going to alarm men like Andrew Jackson when they heard about that. And it may have been calculated to alarm them. And that was also going to really spread like wildfire among slaves in the United States, especially in the Mississippi Territory, which then included parts of what is today Alabama and Mississippi. But that was absolutely the case there at Fort George and at Prospect Bluff. And then after the War of 1812, after Nicolls left, most of the white men who were serving there went with them and were reestablished themselves in Trinidad. But there were some Hispanics who had served in the Spanish military who did remain at Prospect Bluff under the command of Garcon, and under his direction, you know, Cyrus and Prince and some of the other, you know, non-commissioned officers at Prospect Bluff later.